The autumn morning in Austin, Texas carried the crisp promise of change, though Willie Nelson had no idea just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. At 89 years old, the legendary country musician had seen enough surprises in his long life to fill several lifetimes, but nothing could have prepared him for the letter that arrived on October 15, 2023. Willie sat on the wraparound porch of his ranch home in Spicewood, Texas, his weathered hands holding a steaming cup of coffee as the morning mist rolled across the hill country. The mailbox at the end of his long driveway had yielded the usual assortment of fan mail, business correspondence, and promotional materials, but one envelope stood out among the rest. It was addressed in careful, old-fashioned handwriting with a return address from Peaceful Meadows Care Facility in Amarillo, Texas. "Annie," Willie called to his wife, who was tending to her garden nearby. "You ever hear of a place called Peaceful Meadows in Amarillo?" Annie Nelson looked up from her tomato plants, wiping soil from her hands with a gardening towel. "Can't say I have, honey." "Why?" Willie held up the envelope, studying it with the same intensity he once reserved for analyzing song lyrics. "Got a letter from there. Looks official." The envelope felt heavier than its contents should have warranted, as if it carried the weight of something far more significant than mere correspondence. Willie's weathered fingers traced the edge of the paper as he carefully opened it, revealing a single sheet of letterhead from the care facility. "Dear Mr. Nelson," the letter began in the same careful handwriting that had adorned the envelope. "My name is Margaret Thompson, and I am a social worker at Peaceful Meadows Care Facility here in Amarillo. I am writing to you regarding a resident of ours, a gentleman named Thomas Nelson, who has been in our care for the past 3 years. Willie's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Thomas Nelson. The name stirred something deep in his memory, like a song he couldn't quite remember but knew he'd heard before. The letter continued. Mr. Thomas Nelson, who is now 91 years old, has been telling us stories about his younger brother Willie, who he claims became a famous country singer. For the longest time, we thought these were simply the confused memories of an elderly man. But recently, Mr. Nelson has been sharing very specific details about his childhood that have given us pause. Annie had wandered over, drawn by the unusual expression on her husband's face. What is it, Willie? He held up a finger, indicating he needed to finish reading. The letter went on to describe how Thomas Nelson had mentioned a red bicycle that young Willie had received for his 7th birthday, how their father used to play guitar on the front porch of their small house in Abbott, and how Willie had written his first song about a dog named Buster who had been hit by a train. Willie's hands began to tremble slightly. No one knew about Buster except family. That dog had been his constant companion during the darkest days of his childhood, and its death had indeed inspired his first attempt at songwriting. He had never shared that story publicly, not in any interview, book, or documentary. Mr. Nelson, the letter continued, Thomas speaks of you with such love and pride, describing how you would sneak out of your bedroom window at night to practice guitar in the barn because you didn't want to wake anyone up. He remembers the way you used to hum melodies while doing chores and how you promised him that someday you would be famous and take care of the whole family. The letter was signed by Margaret Thompson, LCSW, along with her direct phone number and an invitation for Willie to call if he was indeed the Willie Nelson that Thomas claimed as his brother. Willie set the letter down on his lap and stared out across his property, his mind racing back through decades of memories. He had been born Willie Hugh Nelson in Abbott, Texas, in 1933, but his early family history was complicated. His parents, Ira and Merle Nelson, had struggled during the Great Depression, and Willie had been raised primarily by his paternal grandparents after his parents separated. But there had been other children, hadn't there? His memory of those early years was fragmented, partly by time and partly by the trauma of a broken family during desperate times. He remembered his sister Bobby clearly. She had been his lifelong musical partner until her death in 2022, but there had been others, children who had disappeared from his life when the family scattered like leaves in a storm. "Annie," Willie said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her immediately sit down beside him. "I think I might have a brother I forgot about." Annie Nelson had been married to Willie long enough to know that her husband's past contained mysteries and painful chapters that he rarely discussed. The early years of his life, before music became his salvation, were territory he seldom revisited. "Tell me," she said simply, taking his hand in hers. Willie began to speak, his words coming slowly at first, then faster as memories began to surface, like air bubbles rising from the bottom of a deep pond. During the Depression, families got broken up. Kids got sent to relatives or to homes or just disappeared. I was lucky. My grandparents took me and Bobby in. But there were others. I remember a boy, older than me, but not by much. Thomas. The name felt strange on his tongue after so many decades of silence. He was my half-brother, I think, or maybe step-brother. The family connections were complicated back then, but I remember him. He was kind to me, protected me from the older kids in the neighborhood, and then one day, he was just gone. Willie stood up from his chair and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the Texas landscape that had shaped so much of his music and his identity. My grandparents told me he had gone to live with other relatives, but I was just a kid. I believed what they told me and eventually stopped asking questions. The silence stretched between them as Annie processed this revelation. Finally, she asked the question that hung in the air. "What are you going to do?" Willie turned back to face his wife, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him was excited by the possibility of reconnecting with lost family, but another part was afraid of what he might find, or what pain might be dredged up from the depths of his past. "I guess I'm going to make a phone call," he said, picking up the letter again. "But first, I need to think about this. If this Thomas really is my brother, then he's been in that nursing home for 3 years. Where was he before that? What kind of life has he lived? And why now? Why is this coming up now?" Annie nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe the real question is, what if you don't make that call? Could you live with yourself if you let this opportunity pass by?" That evening, Willie sat in his home studio, surrounded by the guitars and memorabilia of a lifetime in music. He had called his manager, his publicist, and his lawyer, not to plan any kind of media strategy, but simply to talk through the implications of what he was considering. Each conversation had led him to the same conclusion. He had to know the truth. As the sun set over the Texas Hill Country, Willie Nelson picked up his phone and dialed the number on Margaret Thompson's letter. After 3 rings, a warm voice answered. "Peaceful Meadows," Margaret Thompson speaking. "Ms. Thompson," Willie began, his voice steadier than he had expected. "This is Willie Nelson. I got your letter." The conversation with Margaret Thompson lasted over an hour, and by the end of it, Willie Nelson was convinced that he needed to see this man who claimed to be his brother. But he was also determined to do his due diligence. Too many times in his career, he had encountered people who claimed connections to him for various reasons, and he had learned to be cautious. Margaret Thompson had been understanding of his skepticism and had offered to provide any documentation or evidence that might help verify Thomas Nelson's claims. She explained that Thomas had been admitted to Peaceful Meadows 3 years earlier after being found living in deplorable conditions in a run-down apartment in Amarillo. He had no family contacts, no identification beyond an old Social Security card, and no apparent means of support. "The state took custody of his care," Margaret explained, "and he was placed with us. For the first 2 years, he barely spoke to anyone. We thought he might have dementia or some form of cognitive decline. But about 6 months ago, something changed. He started talking about his childhood, about his family, and most specifically, about his younger brother Willie, who became a country music star. Willie had asked Margaret to mail him copies of Thomas's intake paperwork and any other documentation that might shed light on his background. He also requested that she not tell Thomas about their conversation until they could verify more details. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived from Peaceful Meadows. Willie spread the contents across his kitchen table while Annie made coffee and prepared for what might be a long morning of detective work. The intake paperwork painted a heartbreaking picture. Thomas Nelson, born in 1932, had been found by police after neighbors complained about the smell coming from his apartment. He had been malnourished, dehydrated, and living in conditions that the report described as uninhabitable. Medical records showed evidence of a hard life, old fractures that had healed poorly, dental problems that suggested years without proper care, and the general physical deterioration of someone who had struggled to survive. But it was the personal effects inventory that caught Willie's attention. Among Thomas's few possessions had been a small cardboard box containing what the report described as personal memorabilia. The list included 1 photograph of 2 young boys standing next to a wooden fence, 1 harmonica, 1 small wooden cross, and several handwritten lyrics on scraps of paper. "Annie," Willie said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." Among the photocopied documents was a grainy reproduction of the photograph mentioned in the inventory. Despite the poor quality of the copy, Willie could make out 2 young boys, one taller than the other, standing in what appeared to be a farmyard setting. The shorter boy had his arm around the taller one's waist, and both were squinting into the sun. Willie stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to pull details from his memory that might confirm or deny what he was seeing. The problem was that his childhood memories were fragmented and unreliable. Years of living, performing, and simply getting older had blurred the edges of those early experiences. "I need help with this," he finally said. "I need someone who's better at research than I am." That afternoon, Willie called his longtime friend and collaborator, Daniel Harrison, a music journalist who had helped Willie with his memoirs and who had connections throughout Texas for genealogical research. Daniel Harrison arrived at Willie's ranch the next morning, bringing with him a laptop computer, a portable scanner, and the enthusiasm of someone who loved solving historical puzzles. A lean man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Daniel had built his career on uncovering the stories behind the music, and he approached Willie's family mystery with the same methodical precision. "The first thing we need to do," Daniel explained as he set up his equipment on Willie's dining room table, "is establish a timeline. We know when you were born, where you were born, and we know the basic facts about your immediate family. What we need to figure out is where Thomas fits into that picture." Over the next several hours, Daniel and Willie worked through what they knew and what they needed to find out. Daniel had already begun preliminary research into Texas state records, birth certificates, and Depression-era social services documentation. The problem, Daniel explained, is that record-keeping during the 1930s was inconsistent, especially for families that were struggling economically. Kids got moved around, names got changed, and sometimes official records just don't exist. But Daniel had found some promising leads. There were records of several children with the last name Nelson being placed in foster care or institutional settings in Central Texas during the mid-1930s. One of those records, from 1936, mentioned a Thomas Nelson, aged 4, being transferred from a temporary placement to a more permanent facility. 4 years old in 1936 would make him born in 1932, Daniel noted. That matches the age on his intake paperwork from the nursing home. Willie felt a chill run through him. I would have been 3 years old in 1936, old enough to remember having a brother, but young enough that the memory might have gotten buried under everything else that happened. Daniel continued his research, while Willie tried to reconstruct his earliest memories. He remembered living with his grandparents, William and Nancy Nelson, in their small house in Abbott. He remembered his sister Bobby being there, and he remembered feeling safe and loved despite the economic hardships of the time. But there were gaps in those memories, periods that seemed to be missing entirely. And there were fragments of recollections that didn't quite fit with the official story of his childhood. Glimpses of other children, other voices, other faces that might have been part of his family before circumstances scattered them to the winds. By late afternoon, Daniel had compiled enough information to warrant a trip to the Texas State Archives in Austin. "I think we can get more definitive answers," he told Willie, "but it's going to require looking at original documents that aren't available online." Willie made a decision that surprised both Daniel and Annie. "I want to go with you to Austin," he said. "And then, regardless of what we find, I want to go to Amarillo and meet this Thomas Nelson face to face." Annie looked concerned. "Are you sure that's wise? What if it turns out he's not your brother? Or what if he is? But the reunion doesn't go the way you're hoping." Willie considered her questions seriously. "I've spent my whole life writing songs about the human condition. Love, loss, family, redemption. How can I walk away from this story, especially if it's my own story?" That evening, Willie sat on his porch with his guitar, playing softly as the stars emerged in the clear Texas sky. He found himself improvising melodies around themes of memory and family, of things lost and found. The music seemed to be preparing him for whatever he was about to discover. Daniel had agreed to meet him at the Texas State Archives the following Monday. From there, depending on what they learned, Willie was prepared to make the 4-hour drive to Amarillo to meet the man who might be his long-lost brother. As he put his guitar away and prepared for bed, Willie realized that for the first time in years, he felt nervous about the future. His career had given him confidence in almost every situation, but this was different. This was about family, about the past, about parts of himself that he had thought were lost forever. "Whatever happens," he told Annie as they turned off the lights, "at least I'll know I tried to find the truth." The Texas State Archives in Austin occupied a modern building that seemed to hold the entirety of the state's bureaucratic memory within its climate-controlled walls. Willie Nelson, wearing his characteristic braids and a simple black t-shirt, drew some curious glances from other researchers as he and Daniel Harrison were led to a private study room where they could examine historical documents. Their research assistant, Patricia Valdez, was a middle-aged woman with the patience and thoroughness that came from 20 years of helping people navigate the complexities of genealogical research. She had already pulled several boxes of files based on Daniel's preliminary requests. Depression-era family services records can be challenging, Patricia explained as she arranged the boxes on their table. Many families were broken up out of necessity, and the documentation wasn't always consistent. But we do have some foster care administration records from the 1930s that might be relevant to your search. Willie handled the old documents with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of history. Each file folder contained stories of families torn apart by economic circumstances, children placed in temporary care that often became permanent separation, and the bureaucratic language that couldn't quite convey the human cost of those decisions. Daniel worked methodically through the files, while Willie examined photographs and personal documents that had been preserved with the official paperwork. After 2 hours of searching, Daniel suddenly straightened in his chair. "Willie, I think I found something." The file folder contained placement records for 3 children: Willie Hugh Nelson, Bobby Lee Nelson, and Thomas Edward Nelson. According to the documents, all 3 children had been temporarily placed in state custody in November 1935 when their parents were unable to provide adequate care. Willie stared at the paperwork, his name written in careful script next to his siblings. "Thomas Edward Nelson," he read aloud. "I never knew his middle name was Edward." The records showed that while Willie and Bobby had been placed with their grandparents within a few weeks, Thomas had been transferred to a series of foster homes before eventually being placed in the Texas Children's Home Society, an institution that had housed hundreds of displaced children during the Depression era. "There's more," Daniel said, pulling out additional documents. "It looks like Thomas aged out of the system in 1950, when he turned 18. After that, there's no official record of him until his Social Security application in 1952. Patricia had been quietly observing their research and now offered her expertise. It wasn't uncommon for children who aged out of institutional care to simply disappear from official records for years or even decades. They often struggled to establish themselves in adult life without family support networks. Willie felt a growing sense of grief as he contemplated what his brother's life might have been like. While Willie had been nurtured by loving grandparents who encouraged his musical talents, Thomas had been alone in the world, navigating adulthood without the safety net of family. Is there any way to track what happened to him between 1950 and when he showed up at that nursing home? Willie asked. Daniel had already thought about this question. Social Security records might give us some employment history, but we'd need Thomas's permission to access those. What we can do is search public records, marriage licenses, property records, court documents, anything that might show where he lived or what he did for work. They spent the rest of the day compiling what they had learned. The evidence strongly suggested that Thomas Nelson was indeed Willie's older brother, separated from the family during the Depression and lost to the foster care system. The timeline matched, the family name matched, and most importantly, the childhood memories that Thomas had shared with his social worker aligned with details that would have been known only to family members. As they prepared to leave Austin, Willie made a decision. "I'm going to call Margaret Thompson and tell her I want to meet Thomas, but I don't want any media attention, and I don't want to overwhelm him. This needs to be handled carefully." The drive back to Spicewood gave Willie time to process what he had learned. He found himself trying to imagine Thomas's life. 18 years old and alone, no family to turn to, no resources beyond whatever skills he had managed to develop in institutional care. What kind of work had he found? Had he ever married? Had he had children of his own? Had he followed Willie's career, knowing that his little brother had found the success and family that had eluded Thomas himself? That evening, Willie called Margaret Thompson at Peaceful Meadows and explained what he had discovered in the state archives. Margaret listened carefully to his account of the documentation they had found. "Mr. Nelson," she said when Willie finished his summary, "I think you should know that Thomas's health has been declining recently. He's still mentally sharp, but physically, he's quite frail. If you're planning to visit, I would encourage you not to wait too long." Willie felt a sense of urgency that he hadn't experienced before. "Would it be possible for me to come this weekend? I could drive up Saturday morning." Margaret agreed to arrange the meeting, but she had some conditions. "I think it would be best if we prepare Thomas gradually. I'll let him know that someone is coming to visit who might be his brother Willie, but I won't confirm it until you're actually here. And I'd like to have our staff psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Foster, present for the initial meeting. Thomas has been through so much trauma in his life, and we want to make sure this reunion is handled in a way that's therapeutic rather than potentially harmful." Willie agreed to all of Margaret's conditions. As he hung up the phone, he realized that he had less than a week to prepare himself for what might be the most emotionally significant moment of his life. Annie found him that night sitting at his piano, not playing, just sitting with his hands resting on the keys. "How are you feeling about all this?" she asked, settling beside him on the piano bench. "Scared," Willie admitted, "and excited, and guilty. I keep thinking about all the years he was alone while I was building my career, having success, raising my family. If I had tried harder to find him, if I had remembered more clearly." "You were a child when you were separated," Annie reminded him gently. "You can't hold yourself responsible for decisions that adults made during desperate times." Willie nodded, but the guilt remained. "I just hope it's not too late. I hope we can have some time together, even if it's just a little bit." As the week progressed, Willie found himself thinking more and more about the upcoming reunion. He had told only a few close friends and family members about the situation, wanting to keep things private, until he could determine how best to handle the emotional and potentially public aspects of reconnecting with his long-lost brother. On Thursday, 2 days before the planned trip to Amarillo, Willie received another call from Margaret Thompson. "Mr. Nelson," she said, and Willie could hear the excitement in her voice. "I wanted to let you know that I told Thomas someone was coming to visit who believed they might be his brother Willie." His reaction was, well, it was remarkable. He became more alert and talkative than I've seen him since he's been here. He started sharing even more specific memories, and he asked if he could clean himself up and put on his best clothes for the visit. Willie felt his eyes welling with tears. "What did he say exactly?" He said, "I always knew Willie would find me someday. I just hoped I'd live long enough to see him again." Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp in central Texas, with the kind of blue sky that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Willie Nelson stood in his driveway at 6 a.m., loading a small overnight bag into his pickup truck. He had decided to make the drive to Amarillo alone, despite Annie's offers to accompany him and Daniel's suggestion that they might want to document the reunion for posterity. "This needs to be private," Willie had explained to both of them. "Whatever happens when I meet Thomas, it should happen between the two of us first, without witnesses or cameras or any kind of outside pressure." The 4-hour drive through the Texas Panhandle gave Willie plenty of time to think about what he might say to his brother, how he might explain the decades of separation, and what they might be able to build together in whatever time they had left. He had prepared himself for the possibility that Thomas might be in poor health, that his memory might be compromised, or that the reunion might not live up to the emotional expectations that were building in his heart. As the miles passed, Willie found himself remembering fragments of his earliest childhood with a clarity that surprised him. The memories seemed to be triggered by his anticipation of seeing Thomas again, as if his mind was preparing for the reunion by retrieving long-buried experiences. He remembered a song that someone used to sing to him when he was very small, a lullaby about Texas stars and prairie winds. He remembered playing hide-and-seek in a barn with someone taller than him, someone who always let Willie win. He remembered the taste of wild blackberries picked during summer afternoons and the feeling of a protective hand on his shoulder when older children threatened to bully him. Were these memories of Thomas? Willie couldn't be certain, but they felt connected to the anticipation he was feeling about the upcoming reunion. By 10 a.m., Willie was driving through the outskirts of Amarillo, past fields of wheat and cattle ranches that reminded him of the agricultural landscape of his childhood. Peaceful Meadows Care Facility sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees, its single-story brick building designed to look more like a comfortable home than an institutional facility. Margaret Thompson met Willie in the parking lot, having recognized his distinctive appearance even from a distance. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that came from years of working with elderly residents and their families. "Mr. Nelson, thank you so much for coming," she said, shaking Willie's hand with both of hers. "I have to tell you, Thomas barely slept last night. He kept asking the night staff what time it was and whether his visitor had arrived yet." Willie felt nervous in a way that he hadn't experienced since his first performance at the Grand Ole Opry decades earlier. "How is he doing? I mean, what should I expect?" Margaret began walking toward the building's entrance, and Willie fell into step beside her. Physically, he's quite frail. He uses a wheelchair most of the time, and he needs assistance with most daily activities. But mentally, he's still very sharp. Since we told him about your visit, he's been more animated and talkative than we've seen him in years. They paused at the entrance while Margaret prepared Willie for what he was about to see. "I want you to understand that Thomas has lived a hard life. The physical evidence of that is apparent. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, years without proper medical care. But what's remarkable is that he's maintained such a positive spirit and such clear memories of his family." Dr. Rebecca Foster, the facility's staff psychologist, joined them in the lobby. She was a younger woman with short brown hair and the reassuring presence of someone trained to handle emotionally complex situations. "Mr. Nelson," Dr. Foster said, "I've spent quite a bit of time talking with Thomas over the past few days, and I want you to know that he's been preparing for this reunion his entire life. He's talked about you constantly, not just since he's been here, but according to his stories, for decades. You've been a source of hope and pride for him, even during his most difficult times." Willie felt the weight of that responsibility. "I just want to do right by him. I want to make sure this meeting is good for him, not something that causes him distress." Dr. Foster nodded approvingly. "The fact that you're thinking that way tells me you're going to handle this beautifully. Thomas is in the sunroom right now, and he's asked to be positioned so he can see the door when you come in. Are you ready?" Willie took a deep breath and nodded. As they walked down the hallway toward the sunroom, he could hear the faint sound of a harmonica being played. A simple, haunting melody that seemed familiar, but that he couldn't quite identify. "That's Thomas," Margaret whispered. "He's been playing that harmonica almost constantly since yesterday. He says it's a song you wrote, but we haven't been able to identify it." As they approached the sunroom, Willie realized what the melody was. It was "Red-Headed Stranger," but played in a different key and with a slower tempo than he had ever performed it. Somehow, Thomas had known one of his most famous songs and had learned to play it on the harmonica. Margaret opened the door to the sunroom, and Willie got his first glimpse of his brother in more than 7 decades. Thomas Nelson sat in a wheelchair positioned near a large window that looked out on a small garden. He was a small, frail man with white hair and deeply lined skin that spoke of years spent outdoors and in difficult circumstances. But his eyes were bright and alert, and when he saw Willie standing in the doorway, his face transformed with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "Willie," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying a lifetime of hope and recognition. Willie felt his legs carry him across the room without any conscious direction from his brain. In a matter of seconds, he was kneeling beside his brother's wheelchair, looking into eyes that held the same shape and expression as his own. "Thomas," Willie said, and suddenly he was crying. Deep, overwhelming sobs that seemed to come from a place in his heart that had been locked away since childhood. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner." Thomas reached out with a trembling hand and touched Willie's face, tracing the lines and features as if confirming that this reunion was really happening. "You found me now," he said simply. "That's all that matters. You found me now." And then, without any planning or preparation, both brothers were crying and holding each other. and the sunroom at Peaceful Meadows Care Facility became the setting for one of the most emotionally powerful reunions in recent memory. Margaret Thompson and Dr. Foster quietly withdrew from the room, giving the brothers privacy for their first conversation in more than 70 years. Through the window, they could see Willie kneeling beside Thomas's wheelchair, both men talking animatedly as decades of separation seemed to dissolve in the space of minutes. "How long do you think they'll need?" Dr. Foster asked Margaret. Margaret looked back through the window at the two brothers, who were now examining old photographs that Thomas had pulled from a small box beside his chair. "I don't think there's enough time in the world for everything they need to say to each other," she said. "But it's a start." For the first hour, Willie and Thomas talked as if they were trying to compress 7 decades of separation into a single conversation. Thomas shared fragments of his childhood memories: their father's guitar playing, their mother's cooking, the small house in Abbott, where they had lived before everything changed. Willie filled in details from his own memories and shared stories of his career, his family, and the life he had built. "I followed your music," Thomas told him, his voice growing stronger as the conversation continued. "Whenever I could get to a radio, or later when I could afford a small television, I would look for your shows. I bought your records when I had money. I was so proud of you, Willie. So proud." Willie learned that Thomas had lived a difficult but not entirely unhappy life. He had worked construction jobs, ranch work, and various forms of manual labor throughout Texas and the Southwest. He had never married, though he had had several relationships over the years. He had struggled with alcohol for a period in his 40s, but had managed to overcome that challenge. Most importantly, he had never stopped believing that someday he would see his little brother again. "I knew you'd find me," Thomas repeated several times during their conversation. "I always knew you'd find me." After about 2 hours, Dr. Foster gently interrupted to suggest that Thomas might need some rest. Willie could see that his brother was tired, but also reluctant to end their reunion. "I'll come back tomorrow," Willie promised. "And the day after that. And every day until we've caught up on everything." That evening, Willie called Annie from his hotel room in Amarillo and described the reunion in detail. "It was everything I hoped for, and more than I expected," he told her. "He's been carrying memories of our childhood that I had completely forgotten. It's like he's been the keeper of our family history all these years." Annie could hear the emotion in her husband's voice. "How are you feeling about everything?" "Grateful," Willie said without hesitation. "And guilty, but mostly grateful. I realize how lucky I've been, and I want to make sure Thomas knows how much he means to me. I want to make sure his last years are good ones." Willie spent 3 days in Amarillo, visiting with Thomas for several hours each day. On the second day, he brought his guitar and played some of his songs for his brother. Thomas sang along to several of them, revealing a pleasant voice and a remarkable memory for lyrics. On the third day, Willie made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "Thomas," he said during their afternoon visit, "I want you to come home with me. I want you to live at the ranch, where we can spend time together every day." Thomas looked surprised. "Willie, I don't want to be a burden. I need a lot of care now, and—" "You wouldn't be a burden," Willie interrupted. "You'd be family. We can set up a room for you at the ranch, hire whatever help you need. Annie is excited about meeting you, and we have space and resources to make sure you're comfortable." Dr. Foster and Margaret Thompson had anticipated this possibility and had already researched the logistics of transferring Thomas's care to facilities near Willie's ranch. "It's definitely possible," Margaret told Willie. "Thomas's care needs aren't complex, and there are excellent facilities in the Austin area that could coordinate with your private care arrangements." Thomas was overwhelmed by the offer. "Are you sure, Willie? After all these years, you want me to come live with you?" "I'm sure," Willie said firmly. "We've lost enough time already. I don't want to lose any more." The arrangements took several weeks to finalize, but by December 2023, Thomas Nelson was settled into a comfortable suite of rooms at Willie's ranch in Spicewood. Professional caregivers were hired to assist with his daily needs, but Willie and Annie were involved in his care every day. The reunion might have remained a private family matter, but word of Thomas's presence at the ranch gradually spread through Willie's circle of friends and musical collaborators. When journalist Daniel Harrison suggested writing an article about the reunion for a music magazine, Willie initially declined. "This is family business," he said. "It's not entertainment." But Thomas had a different perspective. During one of their many conversations on the ranch porch, he suggested that maybe their story could help other families. "Think about how many people lost touch with their families during hard times," Thomas said. "Maybe if they heard our story, they might try to reconnect with their own lost relatives." Willie considered his brother's words carefully. "You'd be okay with people knowing your story? It hasn't been an easy life, Thomas. People might judge you or feel sorry for you, and I don't want that." Thomas smiled with a wisdom that came from decades of hardship and survival. "Willie, I'm 91 years old. I'm not worried about what strangers think of me. But if our story can help somebody else find their family, or if it can remind people that it's never too late to reconnect, then I think we should tell it." After much discussion with Annie and his management team, Willie agreed to allow Daniel Harrison to write a carefully crafted article about the reunion for Rolling Stone magazine. The piece, titled "Willie Nelson's Greatest Hit, Finding His Long-Lost Brother," was published in February 2024 and immediately captured national attention. The article told the story with sensitivity and respect, focusing on the themes of family, redemption, and the power of never giving up hope. Daniel had interviewed both brothers extensively, and the piece included quotes from Thomas that revealed his dignity, his love for his famous sibling, and his gratitude for their reunion. "I never felt sorry for myself," Thomas was quoted as saying. "I always believed that everything happens for a reason, and that someday Willie and I would be together again. When you have that kind of faith, you can get through anything." The response to the article was overwhelming. Willie's management office received thousands of letters and emails from people sharing their own stories of family separation and reunion. Many readers wrote that the article had inspired them to search for lost relatives or to reach out to family members from whom they had been estranged. More significantly, the story caught the attention of television producers and documentary filmmakers. Within weeks of the article's publication, Willie was fielding offers for interviews, television specials, and book deals. Initially, Willie was resistant to the media attention. "I don't want this to become a circus," he told his manager, Mark Rothbaum. "Thomas is still recovering from years of hardship, and I don't want to exploit his story for publicity." But Thomas himself was surprisingly open to sharing their story more widely. "Willie, you've spent your whole career singing about the human condition. Love, loss, family, hope. This is all of those things rolled into one true story. Maybe it's supposed to be shared." After careful consideration and consultation with Dr. Foster about the potential psychological impact on Thomas, Willie agreed to participate in a television documentary about their reunion. The documentary would be produced by acclaimed filmmaker Sarah Mitchell, known for her sensitive treatment of human interest stories. Sarah Mitchell and her small crew spent several weeks at Willie's ranch in the spring of 2024, documenting the daily interactions between the brothers and interviewing family friends, caregivers, and the social workers who had facilitated their reunion. The resulting documentary, Brothers Found: A Willie Nelson Story, premiered on CBS in June 2024. The documentary was structured around the contemporary story of the brothers' reunion, but it also included historical footage and photographs that illustrated the broader context of family separation during the Great Depression. Historians and social workers provided commentary about the thousands of families that were broken apart during that era, many of whom never found each other again. The most powerful moments in the documentary came from the simple, unguarded interactions between Willie and Thomas. Viewers watched as Willie played guitar while Thomas sang along, as they looked through old photographs together, and as they shared meals on the ranch porch while talking about their memories and their dreams. One particularly moving sequence showed Thomas teaching Willie to play Red-Headed Stranger on the harmonica, the song he had learned by ear decades earlier and had been playing when they first reunited at Peaceful Meadows. "I used to play this when I was missing you the most," Thomas explained in the documentary. "It made me feel closer to you, even when we were so far apart." The documentary concluded with footage of Willie and Thomas attending a small concert that Willie gave for the residents of Peaceful Meadows. Margaret Thompson and Dr. Foster were in the audience, along with several dozen elderly residents who had followed the story of Thomas's reunion with his famous brother. As Willie performed On the Road Again, a song about the joy of reuniting with loved ones, the camera captured Thomas in the front row, tears streaming down his face as he watched his little brother perform. The final shot showed the two brothers embracing after the concert, surrounded by applauding residents who understood the miracle they had witnessed. The documentary won several awards and was viewed by more than 20 million people on its initial broadcast. More importantly, it generated thousands of stories from viewers who had been inspired to search for their own lost family members. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a significant increase in requests for assistance with adult family searches in the months following the documentary's broadcast. Several reunion organizations credited the Willie Nelson story with raising awareness about the possibilities for reconnecting with family members who had been lost to circumstance, time, or misunderstanding. But perhaps the most significant impact of sharing their story was the personal transformation it brought to both brothers. Thomas, who had spent most of his adult life feeling invisible and forgotten, suddenly found himself recognized and celebrated wherever he went. Fans would stop Willie on the street not just to talk about his music, but to ask about Thomas and to share their own family stories. "I never expected to be famous," Thomas told a reporter from People magazine who visited the ranch 6 months after the documentary aired. "But I like that our story has helped other people. That makes everything we went through worthwhile." Willie, meanwhile, found that reconnecting with his brother had given him a new perspective on his own success and legacy. "Having Thomas back in my life has reminded me what's really important," he said in interviews. "Music has been wonderful, and I'm grateful for the career I've had, but family is everything. Nothing matters more than the people you love." The story took an unexpected turn in September 2024, when Willie received a call from a woman named Linda Martinez in Phoenix, Arizona. Linda had seen the documentary and believed she might have information about other members of the Nelson family who had been separated during the Depression. "My grandmother worked for the Texas Children's Home Society in the 1930s, Linda explained during their phone conversation. "After she passed away, we found boxes of old records and photographs that she had kept. Some of the names in those records are Nelson children, and I think there might be other siblings that you and Thomas haven't found yet." Willie felt a familiar stirring of hope and anxiety. Could there be other brothers or sisters out there, still alive, still searching for family? He shared Linda's information with Daniel Harrison, who had continued to research the Nelson family history. And within weeks, they had identified 2 more potential siblings: a sister named Dorothy Nelson, who had been placed with a family in New Mexico, and another brother named Robert Nelson, who had last been documented in Oklahoma in 1952. The search for Dorothy and Robert became the subject of intense media interest, with news crews following Willie and Daniel as they traveled to potential locations and interviewed elderly residents of care facilities throughout the Southwest. In November 2024, they found Dorothy. Dorothy Nelson Castellanos was living in a modest apartment complex in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she had raised 4 children and worked as a seamstress for nearly 40 years. At 89 years old, she was still physically active and mentally sharp, and she remembered both Willie and Thomas clearly. "I always wondered what happened to my little brothers," Dorothy told Willie when he knocked on her door unannounced. "I saw you on television over the years, Willie, and I was so proud. But I never thought you'd remember me." The reunion with Dorothy was filmed for a follow-up documentary, and the footage of the 3 siblings together, Willie, Thomas, and Dorothy, sitting around Dorothy's kitchen table and sharing memories, became some of the most emotionally powerful television of the year. Unfortunately, the search for Robert Nelson was less successful. They found records indicating that he had served in the Korean War and had lived in various locations throughout Oklahoma and Kansas, but the trail went cold in the 1970s. Despite extensive searching and media appeals, Robert was never located, and they eventually concluded that he had likely passed away. By the end of 2024, the story of Willie Nelson's family reunions had become one of the most widely followed human interest stories in recent memory. The original documentary had been translated into multiple languages and broadcast internationally. A book about the reunions, written by Daniel Harrison with Willie's cooperation, had become a bestseller. And most importantly, the story had generated hundreds of successful family reunions as people around the world were inspired to search for their own lost relatives. Thomas Nelson, who had spent most of his life in obscurity and poverty, found himself receiving fan mail and invitations to appear at events throughout the country. While his health limited his ability to travel, he enjoyed the attention and particularly loved hearing from other people who had been reunited with family members after years of separation. "I used to think my life was a sad story," Thomas reflected during an interview on his 92nd birthday in March 2025. "But now I realize it was always a hopeful story. I just had to live long enough to see how it ended." Willie, meanwhile, had begun incorporating the theme of family reunion into his live performances. He would often tell the story of finding Thomas and Dorothy before performing songs about home, family, and belonging. Audiences responded with standing ovations, and many fans approached Willie after concerts to share their own reunion stories. The impact of the Nelson family reunions extended far beyond entertainment and media attention. Social service organizations reported increased funding for family search programs. Genealogy websites saw dramatic increases in membership. And perhaps most significantly, families around the world began to reconsider the possibility of healing old wounds and reconnecting with relatives from whom they had been separated by time, distance, or misunderstanding. As 2025 progressed, Willie Nelson found himself in the unique position of being celebrated not just for his musical legacy, but for his role in one of the most inspiring family stories of the modern era. The man who had spent decades singing about life on the road had discovered that the most important journey was the one that led him home to his long-lost family. On a warm evening in July 2025, Willie sat on his ranch porch with Thomas and Annie, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas was playing his harmonica softly, working through a melody that Willie had been humming earlier in the day. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Willie said to his brother. "What's that?" "All the years we were apart, I thought I was living my life story. But it turns out I was only living part of it. Finding you and Dorothy, that's when the real story began." Thomas smiled and set down his harmonica. "Maybe that's the point, Willie. Maybe we're never too old to discover new chapters in our story." As the stars began to appear in the clear Texas sky, Willie Nelson realized that at 92 years old, he was still writing the most important songs of his life, not with words and music, but with love, family, and the enduring power of hope that had brought his family back together after more than 7 decades apart. The story of Willie Nelson's reunion with his long-lost siblings had reminded the world that family bonds transcend time, distance, and circumstance. It had shown that it's never too late to search for what you've lost, never too late to forgive, and never too late to come home. And in a world that often seemed divided by differences, the Nelson family reunions had provided a simple but powerful reminder of what truly matters: the love that connects us to each other, the hope that sustains us through difficult times, and the joy that comes from finding our way back to the people who matter most.